Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, Senior Editor at Forbes. As of 10 a.m. Eastern Time, Friday morning, November 1st, more than 66 million early votes have been cast in the 2024 presidential election. Joining us now to talk about the early voting trends is political science professor Michael McDonald. He's at the University of Florida, which puts out the Election Lab. This is where we're getting all of our data about early voting. And Michael, I have to say, I have been refreshing this site like mad this week. The number of early votes has just continually increased. Can you talk about the trends that we're seeing broadly? 66 million is quite a large number of votes to be cast before Election Day.
Well, you and everybody else. I mean, we've had nearly 10 million people hit that page so far, and so it's quite popular. And in terms of the trends we're seeing, I expect to see around half of the votes being cast early this election cycle. We may get into some of the differences from past that may cause me to adjust at the end. But if we're on track for that, we're going to have about 160 million people vote. It's going to be a turnout rate that's just slightly lower than what we had in the 2020 election.
I was going to ask about the comparisons to 2020 because, of course, we were in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic in November 2020. So a lot of people felt safer doing a mail-in ballot versus going in person. So what do you make of the early voting this cycle? Is it less enthusiastic than in 2020 because we're not in the middle of a pandemic in the same way?
Well, as expected, we saw fewer mail ballots being cast. And so we're not going to have 2/3 of the votes being cast early this election cycle. That's not the expectation. The long-term trend has been a steady increase in the usage of early voting from election to election. And if we took that trend and just projected it out, we were at just slightly less than 50% of the electorate would be voting early this cycle. And so again, if we're going to be about 80 million votes, that gets us about 160 million people voting overall, and gets us a turnout rate that's going to be somewhere around 64, 65%.
64, 65%. That is a frustrating number. What would it take to get to 100%?
Well, I mean, we could have compulsory voting where you're fined if you don't vote. That's how some countries get to exceptionally high turnout rates. And in those countries, what you see are a good number of people who vote just a protest ballot. They go in, they don't want to get fined the $100 like in Australia. And so they'll just leave their ballot blank, or they'll cast a write-in for some protest candidate. So yeah, we could get there if we fined people if they didn't vote, but I don't think that would fly in the United States.
I don't think it would either. So based on the trends that you're seeing now, are you predicting that we're not perhaps going to set record turnout in 2024? It's looking like it'll be roughly on track with 2020 and maybe 2016.
I mean, we could get close to a record turnout in raw numbers because the population is always growing. But 2020 was an exceptional election. You have to understand that was the highest turnout rate for a presidential election since 1900, so 120 years. That was truly exceptional, and it would be unusual to be able to repeat something like that. Anything above 61% would be beating the long-term high level that we've had in modern elections starting back in 2008.
Now, let's get into some of the breakdowns in terms of who is doing this early voting. According to UFL's website, we have right now, as of the moment that we're speaking on Friday morning, 38.4% of the early vote has been folks who are registered Democrat, 36.1% folks registered Republican, 25.4% with no party affiliation or minor party affiliation. How does this breakdown speak to you, and how does that compare to 2020?
Well, first we have to understand that those are just party registration statistics in places that have party registration. So it's not the entire country. Only about half the states have party registration. And that's, of course, used for primary elections for qualifying in closed or semi-closed primaries. Closed primaries are where only registered party affiliates can vote in that primary. Semi-closed are where unaffiliated voters can also um, uh, participate in a party's primary. So most states, well, about half don't even have party registration. And then we have to understand that that those numbers are highly influenced by one of the largest states in the country that has party registration, and that's California. So the numbers there, you have to start digging down into the states, and you're going to see a lot of variation across the states in terms of the number of Democrats and Republicans, at least registered Democrats and Republicans who have voted. And theirs is where we start getting into some of the interesting trends and try to forecast out what may be happening within those states.
I was just about to ask, you have a map of all 50 states that's kind of color coded based on the number of early votes. And some states like Florida are the heaviest filled in. It's some of the heaviest early voting. But what are the states that are standing out to you right now, or the storylines that are standing out to you right now?
Well, two of the battleground states that produce party registration statistics are North Carolina and Nevada. So there's been a lot of interest about those states. We also have Pennsylvania and Arizona, and there's some dynamics there that are interesting. But unfortunately, in states like Wisconsin and Michigan, if we're looking across the Rust Belt states that may be determinative in the Electoral College, only Pennsylvania is the only one that has party registration, and it's not using in-person early voting. And so, as we'll talk about, I mean, there's some very interesting dynamics with in-person early voting that are going on right now that we can see in places like North Carolina and others that have in-person early voting. And so that lack of in-person early voting in Pennsylvania is lowering the overall numbers of early votes and is giving us greater uncertainty about what the meaning of that vote is.
Oh, interesting. So when you said the in-person early voting in North Carolina is telling an interesting story, what is the story that is being told there by the data, by the early voting?
Yeah, and this is in Nevada too, and it's in lots of different places where we do have party registration. So what we can see from the votes that are being cast so far, in 2020, we had lots of Democrats deciding to vote by mail. And largely that trend has continued. It continued in 2022. We thought it would continue this election, and indeed that's how it's playing out. So voting by mail seems to be the preferred method of voting for Democrats this cycle. That's really a change. I mean, before 2020, it was Republicans who generally voted by mail if you're not in a vote by mail state. And so we've had a change of behavior. But even in before 2020, we would see Democrats voting in person early quite frequently. In 2020, all those Democrats get shifted to mail voting, and that leaves only really Republicans who are voting in person early. And so there was a shift of Democrats out of in person early voting, where they had been voting in person early in prior election cycles, and suddenly we're left with predominantly Republicans that are voting in person early. And so we might have expected, well, all right, so maybe there are going to be more Democrats voting by mail. Maybe there's going to be less in-person early voting this cycle as a consequence of those shifts, even though, again, we have to consider that we had the 2020 pandemic with lots of people voting by mail. So maybe we see some shifts. But that was not what happened this cycle. We saw something very unusual, and it's never been seen in early voting before, the in-person early voting, which is that Republicans started showing up in force as soon as the in-person early voting period started. So even in 2020 or 2022, Republicans might vote in-person early, but they would wait much later, and they would vote either late in the in-person early voting period or on election day. This time around, they're voting really a surge of Republicans voting in person early. And so that's very unusual. We have never seen something like that in the data before. Likely, this has something to do with Donald Trump, because prior to this election cycle, Trump would say that all early voting is fraudulent to some degree. And this time around, he's modulated his rhetoric. He has said that in-person early voting is okay, but mail balloting is still bad. And that seems to have given a green light for his supporters to vote in person early and do it sooner than they had in previous cycles. So, taking a big step back and looking at the big picture, it there's like an analogy with the tortoise and the hare. Usually you'd see like the hare being the Democrats. So they would jump out to a lead in the early vote. And then that lead would start getting winnowed down later in the early voting period. And it would be either by mail or by in person. This year, the hare is the Republicans because in person early voting, those numbers came out really fast and in unprecedented numbers. And so the partisan distribution of the early electorate in places like North Carolina and Nevada look much more Republican at this point in time than they have in the past. But we can see that these are people who are super voters by and large. They're people who have a past voting history. They were voting on election day or they were voting later in the early voting period. And so now the sort of outstanding question is that was this just a shift of people voting where they in the past Republicans would have been voting maybe more on election day, but now they're voting in person earlier? Or is this going to be something that's going to carry through all the way to election day? And here's where, we don't know. There's been a change of behavior. And so in these states, we're going to have to wait and see like how this all plays out rather than to jumping to conclusions that, oh, the numbers look really good for Republicans. They look better than they ever have. That's true. But we don't know how much of it is a shift of when people are voting. And that's going to be the outstanding question we're going to have through to election day.
And of course, just because someone is affiliated with a certain political party does not necessarily mean they will vote for the candidate of that political party. So is it at all possible to read the tea leaves right now in terms of what the early voting trends mean for either former President Trump or Vice President Kamala Harris?
Well, you're putting your finger on another interesting dynamic that we're seeing. So we know that the polling shows perhaps the largest gender gap that we've ever seen, where more women are supporting Harris and more men are supporting Trump. And so there's this huge gap in the polling. We'll see if it's bigger than 2016 or not, but there are some suggestions we're going to at least have a 2016 level gender gap, if not more. So with all these Republicans voting early, you would expect then that given that gender gap that shows up in the polling, that you'd see a shift in more men voting early. But that's not happening. And this is a bit of a head scratcher as well, which is that no, we see a gender distribution with the early vote that actually looks very similar to past elections. And it's about a 10 percentage point advantage among women in that gender distribution. So again, we get two things that seem to be at odds with one another. Republicans are voting more. The early vote looks better for Republicans in places like Nevada and North Carolina where we can look at it. But we're also seeing a gender distribution that looks very similar to past elections. How can that be? And it's a little bit complicated. And it goes to your question, like, this is just party registration? Is it really telling us something about how these people vote? In the past, party registration has been highly correlated with being able to make predictions on who is going to win and forecasting election outcomes. But this is a little bit of a head scratcher. And so to get down into the weeds on it, what's happening here is that even while lots of Republicans are voting, there are actually more Republican women voting than Republican men. Even as there's been more of, and that's actually similar as we saw in past election cycles. So we really haven't seen the men show up to vote yet. Now there's some variation across states, but this is going to be a key thing to watch. Will election day be a vast number of men that are voting on election day? That's going to be a signal that, what we saw with the early vote was not necessarily how election day is going to play out. It never does. But the other part of it is, well, how much, to what degree are these women being cross-pressured? Because some of them, they're a good number of them are registered Republicans. Not all of them. I mean, most of them are. There's also Democrats and unaffiliated women in there too, and they're voting at slightly higher rates as well. So is this uh, something to do about the Dobbs decision? Is it something to do about Harris potentially being the first female president? Um, is it something else that's driving women to be engaged at unusual levels, despite what we would have thought was happening with party registration? Again, we can't know for certain because we don't really know how these people vote. Only on election day will the votes be tallied, and then the truth will be revealed about what was driving people, their party registration or their gender. If I were to take a guess, both are pressures that are being put on people to vote, and we're probably looking at some truth that's like halfway in between of what we would think the signal for Republican voting would be and what we might think about the gender gap.
That's so interesting. And this might be a basic question, but is there exit polling with early voting, the in-person early voting? And I ask because I'm wondering, will we get the answers to your questions about motivation, or will we forever live in wonder?
Well, one of the things I do, among many others, and one of the reasons why I collect all this early voting data is to actually know the size of the early vote and forecast out turnout for the exit poll organization. So I consult with them. And yes, they are running early voter polls. Some of them are by phone in states that use high levels of mail balloting, but they also have in-person early voting locations. They have pollsters out of a sample of those places as well. And unfortunately, this is where I have an NDA, non-disclosure agreement, and I can't tell you anything about what's going on with those polls.
Well, you can't tell us now, but we'll have to have you back once the NDA expires or once all the polling comes out. But to get back to the gender divide and who's early voting, if you cross-reference the party data and the gender data, is it more Democratic men are staying home right now, or is it equal numbers of men across Republicans, Democrats, and unaffiliated who haven't gone to early vote yet?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting dynamic. Again, the reason why we have this imbalance on the partisanship is that Republicans were really fast out of the gate and voting at unusual numbers. That's how we could get these record first day early voting numbers in places like North Carolina and Georgia. That was widely reported at the time. But then what's happened is, and this is some of this is what we expect. I mean, we typically you'll see like a rush of voters the first day of early voting, in-person early voting, and then it tails off very quickly, and then it rises back up again once we get close to election day. We're seeing a different pattern again this year. These are difficult tea leaves to read. So the initial surge was high, but it was declining at a less steep rate than it had in the past. And then it's since flattened out. And it looks like those Republicans who voted early in large numbers, they're not really continuing to carry through with large numbers as we're getting later in the period, which is why we might think that, well, this is just a shifting of when people are voting. It's not an indication of overall enthusiasm for Republicans to vote. Of course, the people who are voting are enthusiastic, so I don't want to diminish them. For Democrats, though, we were seeing a different pattern. Even in the pandemic, we saw more Democrats voting in person early than on the first day of in-person early voting in places like North Carolina, where we have that good data. And so for the first week, the Democrats are actually working at a deficit. And it wasn't until the second week and this last third week of in-person early voting where the Democrats are above their 2020 levels. So it almost looks as though Republicans, very much energized, came out to vote very quickly. Democrats changed their behavior and are voting later in the early voting period. So it's flipping everything on its head, going back to that hare and tortoise analogy. Again, usually you see the Democrats jumping out to a big lead, and then it's Republicans catching up. This cycle, it's Republicans jumping out to a big lead, and then it's Democrats catching up. So we've still got a few more days as we're talking here about early voting, and we're just going to have to see where this lands. One other thing, we've been talking a lot about in-person early voting because it's such a fascinating story. But let me mention Nevada a little bit, because it also, that discussion I just had about the timing is relevant. So another dynamic that we have happening in this election cycle compared to 2020 is that, well, in 2020, we knew that the post office was running late on its mail. I mean, everybody was experiencing this personally, but there were also lots of stories about how this was affecting mail balloting. And so in 2020, you saw mail ballots get returned very quickly in places where people were using them, especially the vote by mail states, but lots of other places too. We could see not only were Democrats voting by large numbers by mail, but they were returning their ballots much faster, those mail ballots. And this cycle, it looks more like a 2016 scenario where the Democrats, the mail ballots, at least, and that would also include Republicans, those ballots are not coming in at as much of a fast of a rate early on as they were in 2016. But the levels are still above 2016. So there's still a lot of engagement there. It's just that there seems to be a shift on the timing of when the mail ballots are coming back too. And since Democrats use mail ballots so much more frequently, that in some places we're going to see, again, this tortoise and hare where the Republicans got out to a big lead, but that plotting that's going to come on with the mail ballot it's going to catch up with the Republicans. This matters for Nevada. Nevada is a vote by mail state, but it also makes available early voting locations. And we can see in the data, Republicans are voting in person early. Trump has given them a green light. They showed up in large numbers. Even if they had mail ballots, they were voting in person early. And so what we're also seeing, though, is the mail ballots coming in, and they're starting to change the composition again of the Republicans started out with a big lead. Now it's evened out on a daily basis. And what's going to happen in the coming days is of great interest, because if those mail ballots are going to start coming back later, as they look like they are doing, we're going to start seeing more Democrats getting into the mix in Nevada. And so the numbers that you're seeing out of Nevada right now, I would caution, like I would not project that out to election day. I think almost, with a high degree of certainty, we're going to see more Democrats returning those mail ballots. And then there's one other twist for Nevada. Nevada is among a group of other states that that counts ballots that are postmarked by election day, but are received after election day. And for Nevada, that rule is 4 days. So in the past, we've seen, even in 2022, we saw tens of thousands of ballots coming back through the mail arriving after election day. So if it's particularly close in Nevada, if Trump has a lead, but it's a small lead, and if the election's coming down to Nevada, we could be in a situation where the media organizations are holding off on calling Nevada because they're still waiting to see those mail ballots get returned to election offices.
I was just about to ask you about the early voting trends and what it means for counting votes. So what you just said indicates that Nevada could pose a several-day wait in terms of when it is called. What about a state like North Carolina, where you have this good data, where the early voting's been strong? Does that give them a head start in counting, and could it get called the minute polls close in North Carolina, or do state-by-state rules just make this impossible to predict?
Yeah, so there are, let's think about mail ballots and in-person early voting. When you vote in person, or even in person on election day, early or on election day, you go in, you show your identification. There's a verification process that happens there as you're being checked in to vote. And then you can go over and cast your ballot. and that ballot may actually get tabulated on the spot. You may run your paper ballot through a counter or not. Maybe it goes into a hopper and you're just verifying your vote. But there's this whole process, and election officials are going to be able to tabulate those votes very quickly because the verification process has already taken place. For mail ballots, there's this extra step of verification that is not happening at the polling location. The election officials are looking at the mail ballot as it comes in with its envelope. There may be, it really depends on the state. There may be required information that's on the outside envelope, a signature, something else. That information may be contained on the inside of the envelope, and another envelope that's inside, or an affidavit that's signed. Again, the rules vary across the states, and so election officials have to do that extra verification step, looking at the envelope, and then they have to separate the ballot from the envelope once they know that this is a valid vote. And we separate the ballots, of course, because we don't want this is a secret ballot, and so we don't want to know how that person voted. So they separate the ballot out, they put it into a hopper, and then it can be counted. And so there's this just extra process of looking at envelopes, verifying people's identity, and then prepping the ballot to be counted. That doesn't happen to the same degree with in-person early voting or election day in-person voting. That extra step then is where we get into how mail ballots can take longer to count. And some states, North Carolina would be one of them. Same with my state of Florida, because there's often a lot of comparisons. Why can't people do like Florida? Well, here in Florida, North Carolina, some other states, election officials can do all that verification before election day. And so what election day is just as soon as midnight hits, election officials can begin running those mail ballots through the counters. And by the time the polls close, because they've been doing this all day, they can report out very quickly what the mail ballot counts are. But in places like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, state officials, and primarily Republicans, have not allowed election officials to do those extra verification steps and separating the ballots from the envelopes, all of that. They don't let them do that. And that's how we get the late reporting that comes out of places like Milwaukee and Philadelphia on the mail ballots. It's those election officials could be given extra time, and we wouldn't have these claims of vote fraud or ballot dumps or anything like that. We would look much more like Florida and North Carolina, lots of other places where those mail ballots are reported as soon as the polls close. But that's not what happens out of Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. Michigan, the election officials in the past haven't been given this extra time, but this time around, they are going to have some lead time. And so we expect the mail ballots to be reported faster than they have been in the past within Michigan. But we're going to have to see. I mean, this is the first time we're going to see this different preparation that the election officials have in Michigan.
Speaking as an impatient journalist who's a little bit of a policy wonk, what would it take for Pennsylvania and Wisconsin to change their policies here? Would it take the governor or the state government instituting a ballot measure for people to vote on, or could they just, with the sign of a pen, change the system?
These are just laws, so it's not a constitutional amendment or anything like that. So if Republicans wanted to join with the Democrats in those states, it would be very easy to pass a law, just like they, passed a law in Michigan that made it easier for the election officials to process mail ballots sooner rather than later. But this feeds into the claims that the election is fraudulent, because we're going to see potentially in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, these ballots come reported later, and they'll look really suspicious. I mean, they're just votes, and other places they would have been counted earlier, but here in these two states they're not. And since both states could be decisive in the Electoral College, those ballots being reported could flip the who is currently leading in those states. Maybe not. We have to see how everything gets processed on election day and everything else. But that's a real possibility that we're going to see this so-called red mirage in those states where it looks like Trump is leading, but we know there's a lot of mail ballots yet to be reported. And so the election officials and the media are going to be holding off on calling an election outcome. But Donald Trump may be out there declaring victory, even though we know that there are a large number of mail ballots that will likely break towards Harris yet to be counted.
So your message to the electorate and the American people right now is that those mail-in ballots are not fraudulent, correct?
Yeah, in other states, we process them. There's no claims about the fraud on them. Here in Florida, Georgia, lots of other places. It's only when we get these big dumps that people like to claim that that's somehow manipulating the election, but they're just counting. And also understand, if you think I'm wrong on this, the Trump campaign and Republicans will have lawyers and observers in the election offices while these ballots are being counted. So if they actually saw anything fraudulent, they could take it to a court. They could take it to a judge. And in 2020, Trump and his lawyers took these claims of vote fraud to courts, and they lost every time. There was no evidence of it. They had to fabricate some very wild theories about what was going on, or they would provide no evidence. And even Trump appointed judges would shut that down and say, no, there's no evidence that you're providing to us. So again, the lawyers are there. Trump's lawyers are going to be there. If they see something amiss, they'll win in a court. They're going to have Trump judges, appointed judges, that would be very sympathetic to the claims that are being made by the Trump lawyers. So if there's even a shred of evidence that there's something amiss, we will know about it, and certainly the Trump campaign would know about it.
One final question before I let you go, and it's about age. I spoke with the CEO of Vote.org earlier this week, who talked about the record number of 18-plus-year-olds, Gen Zs, that have registered to vote this cycle. But according to the early voting data that the University of Florida Election Lab has, this demographic is the smallest demographic in terms of early voters. What do you take that to mean in terms of Gen Z and younger voter enthusiasm this cycle?
Well, we know that turnout is highly correlated with age. So it's not surprising to see lower turnout among younger voters. That's just, ever since we started doing survey, it's back in the late 1940s, early 1950s, this has been a truth that we've seen in surveys. Younger people vote at lower rates. And then once we started getting the actual voter records to look at this from another angle, again, we could see the same pattern. So this is something that we know is going to happen. But I would say up to this point, largely we've seen super voters voting early. And it's only here in the last week of in-person early voting and on election day itself that we're going to see larger numbers of younger voters who are showing up to vote. And so I still think we have to let it cook a little bit here. Give it a few more days. I think we're going to start seeing, and we're already seeing it in the data, because I track this internally. I may not post it on the site, but I can already see like the median age of the voters on a daily basis. It's declining as we might expect. We're seeing more unaffiliated voters, but also we're seeing, since these are younger voters and they tend to be more diverse, but they don't have very strong partisan attachments. Yes, they're less likely to register with a party, but when they do register with a party, they're going to more likely register with the Democratic Party. And so that's, again, why we need to kind of wait here at the very end of the early voting period, because we're going to see more of these younger voters in, and they're probably going to break a little bit towards the Democrats. And I can already see that in some of the data that I'm looking at as I really dig down deep into the data. So these are patterns that we've normally seen throughout the years, is that Younger people are going to vote. If they are going to vote, they're going to vote later in the process.
Michael McDonald, University of Florida professor and election lab director, thank you so much for joining us and breaking down this data. It is so, so interesting, and we so appreciate your time.
Wonderful to talk with you.